Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you very much. My name is Joe Gary, and I'm delighted to welcome you to Broadway Buzz and our astonishing show, Wicked. It has just celebrated its 10th anniversary on Broadway. It is a pop cultural phenomenon. It's in this recent holiday, it was the top-selling show on Broadway, playing to 102%. God knows where they put those poor people. And I'm happy to tell you that they spent $300 a ticket to see the show in New York, so you're really getting a bargain here. In any case, you're seeing a show that is a kind of seminal show. It's brilliant on so many levels in terms of its sort of dense and interesting and compelling story. It's phenomenal music that has tremendous range. The music goes from sort of medieval chants to pop songs that are indelible to ballads that just take you right through the roof. It's an extraordinary score, brilliantly conceived. 200 of the most spectacular costumes you've ever seen, 100 wigs. It's an extraordinary work. It took 14 trucks to bring all of the scenery to Cleveland to present Wicked. It's an amazing show. Let me go back to the beginning. You know, great ideas have a way of perpetuating themselves through time. So let me introduce, of course, the man who started this whole idea. His name was Lyman Frank Baum. He was born in 1866 and he died in 1919. He, of course, was the brilliant author of the book that was originally called The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. It was shortened to The Wizard of Oz in subsequent editions, but its original title was The Wonderful Wizard of Oz. It's so interesting when you look at his life, and it's really worth taking a few minutes to look at Frank Baum's life, because he lived 2/3 of his life mostly being a failure before he finally had this triumphant success with The Wizard of Oz. It took him 2/3 of his life to find the yellow brick road, but when he did, he certainly went over the rainbow. Okay, so to begin with, he was born, as I told you, in 1866. His father, actually, and he lived right near Syracuse, New York. His father was an oil baron who was in competition with John D. Rockefeller. So he was born into a very wealthy family. He lived in a palatial Victorian home. But as a young boy, he was diagnosed with a very severe heart condition. And he spent his whole life suffering with this severe heart condition. It ultimately would take him at the end of his life. But as a child then, he was very protected, living a very quiet life with his family. So issues that would become enormously important to him very early on, the sense of family and the security of home. Of course, this will be the whole hallmark of the development of Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz. And also, as a young boy, he suffered nightmares where he was always being chased by a mysterious scarecrow. So the scarecrow would, of course, become one of the images that would come back in his life much later on. So as a young boy, he had this tremendous sense of imagination. Because he was really a sort of semi-invalid as a child, he read all of Charles Dickens and all of Thackeray and all of the English fairy tales. So from a very early age, he had this very sophisticated sense of imagination because he was drawing on the great masters of the day, the great storytellers of the day, who could tell compelling stories in a very innovative way with tremendously dimensional characters, etc. So this would serve him very well later in his life when he would create the Oz series. As a young man, his father worried that he wasn't going to be able to cope with life if he continued to lead this very sheltered life. So they sent him off to a military academy in Peekskill, New York. And it was two of the most unhappy years of his life. I mean, this poor, delicate little boy who really didn't have the capacity to play the games that young boys play, and especially the rigors of a military school would act in a very detrimental way. The only good thing about Peekskill is that it had a yellow brick road. So, in any case, he happily, after 2 years, followed that yellow brick road right out of Peekskill, right back to the warm and embracing family that so nurtured his ideas. He was sort of the lifeblood of the family. He would always entertain the family with his innovative stories. He always had this phenomenal sense of magic. And from a very early age, he had this brilliant capacity to be a wonderful storyteller. So he would entertain his family with these sort of imaginative stories that he would create. As a young man, he went to his father and said, you know, I don't want to go into the oil business with you. His father was having a great deal of trouble with John D. Rockefeller, who was sort of pushing him out of the oil business. And keep in mind, there are many people who believed that the character of the wizard was really based on John D. Rockefeller. And when you look at some of those early drawings in the book, you will see the similarities. So in any case, as a young man, he said to his father, my real love is the theater. And so to prove his interest, he very quickly wrote a play. And it was a play with music. It was a kind of melodrama. And it was called The Maids of Erin. And he played the male lead in it. And the show was so successful that it literally toured around America for 2 years. So he thought he had found his place in the world, being an actor, writing plays. It was fulfilling all of his fantasies, using all of his dreams, his ability to write. When he was a child at home, his father gave him a printing press, and he would produce a daily newspaper for the family to read. And they were always waiting every day for that local newspaper that would talk about family secrets, etc. So the end result was that his father said, all right, I will build a small theater for you, near Syracuse, which they did. And then Frank started writing copious he wrote endless plays. He was very prolific. So he had about 12 scripts ready to go into rep in his new theater. He opened a show that he called Matches, and sadly and ironically, during the run of Matches, the theater burned down. So it must have created tremendous sparks. But in any case, that sort of ended his theater career. And from this point, as a very young man in his early 20s, he had had all this sort of early success. Suddenly he had nothing. He married a very interesting woman whose mother was one of the great feminists of the day. They had several children. And to try to find a life for themselves, they moved west. And they lived in South Dakota. And the first thing that Frank did was to open a store, and he called it Baum's Bazaar. And he had a very big heart, and he wasn't a very good businessman. So all the settlers that came in would say, well, I don't have cash to give you. And he'd say, okay, I'll give it to you on credit. Well, lo and behold, no one paid up on the credit. And the end result was that the business went bankrupt. He then opened a newspaper called the Aberdeen Gazette. And again, he had this writing skill, and he was always trying to find a way of manifesting his writing ability. But keep in mind, a news person has to write news, facts. And what Frank Baum liked to do was write fantasy. And so, his newspaper was loaded with fantasy and very few facts. And the end result was that the newspaper also filed bankruptcy. So he came back to Chicago, really very dejected. He now has a family of 4 young boys and a very devoted wife. He was a very intense father. Every night he would spend hours telling his children stories. Finally, his mother-in-law wisely said to him, you shouldn't be telling these stories. You should be writing them down. And she literally forced him to do this. But before he was able to sell anything, the family was in such dire straits that he had to go on the road selling china. And being on the road was very difficult for him because he had this very severe heart condition. And so while he was away, he so missed his family that at night he would write for hours and write these wonderful sort of reworkings of Mother Goose and tales like that, and writing them in this very sort of elegant prose. Finally, incidentally, you remember that selling china is an important element in the story of Wizard of Oz, incidentally. So in any case, he comes back home and his mother-in-law says to him, "You've got to stop this travel. It's going to kill you. I really take the time to write down these stories." And so in 1898, he published a work called Mother Goose Prose. And he took the wonderful Mother Goose stories in rhyme and he wrote them in prose, and it became a bestseller. Maxfield Parrish illustrated that first edition. And so suddenly, overnight, this man that had been a failure substantially for 2/3 of his life suddenly became a celebrity, and he became the most famous children's writer in America. The next year, he followed it with a work called Father Goose, and that, of course, became a bestseller. But the important element of that publication is that they used an illustrator who would go on to work with him. W.W. Denslow was his name, and he would go on to create the magical visual world of The Wizard of Oz. So in the year 1900, The Wizard of Oz is published. Now, keep in mind, all of the elements, he had worked with his children for years. One of the ways he entertained his children was to create a Tin Man. And in real life, he would take the pot that they would cook in, the little pieces of metal that he would find would become parts of the Tin Man, and he would literally create a Tin Man and play the role for his children. And of course, that would be translated into the story. He, of course, saw himself as the Cowardly Lion because life had been so difficult for him, and remembering those hard days in the military academy, the Cowardly Lion sort of came out of those stories. And the days in South Dakota where he met very simple sort of prairie people would become the basis, of course, for those brilliant characters, Auntie Em and Dorothy and those wonderful creatures that came out of, he defined it as Kansas in his story, but it was certainly based on his life there. So actually, what happened was he took his whole life and put it together into this story. And of course, when The Wizard of Oz premiered, it became an instant bestseller. In fact, it was so successful, and there was such a cult following for The Wizard of Oz that he was forced to write a series of sequels. And ultimately, he would write a total of 14 Oz stories. After his death, the demand was still so great every year to have a new Oz story that the publishing company commissioned a woman that they called the Oz Historian, and she would write 26 more sequels to The Wizard of Oz. So in total, there are 40 books that are part of this enormous and imaginative world. In 1903, to sort of bring his theater life back together, he wrote a musical version of The Wizard of Oz, which played on Broadway and was an enormous success. It was done in the style of vaudeville, and it was done in the style of a traditional sort of review at the turn of the period. But it was the most successful musical in New York, and it toured for 3 years. So almost everything he did turned to gold. Ironically, he would die in 1916. He gave the Tin Man a heart, but sadly, he wasn't able to give himself a heart, and he died of heart failure in 1916. But he left this tremendous legacy. And then, of course, in 1939, the most popular movie ever made was created. There's a whole story there that I don't have time to go into, but it's an amazing story of how Hollywood took that brilliant story of The Wizard of Oz and could transform it into the most memorable and most beloved musical ever. I just want to tell you 2 tiny little pieces of this story. They had so much trouble making The Wizard of Oz, they fired countless directors, they fired countless screenwriters. At the beginning, Judy Garland looked more like Lana Turner. They had her in a blonde wig, and George Cukor came in for a few weeks to direct, and he said, "What are you doing with that child? She looks like a cross-dresser." And he ripped the wig off and said, "Stop doing all those affectations and just live up to your brown eyes and say the words." And of course, Judy Garland would then give one of the most indelible impressions ever in film. And then, of course, we have the ultimate wicked creature, the Wicked Witch of the West, Margaret Hamilton, who many of you know actually was from Cleveland, and would very often, she studied at the Cleveland Playhouse, and all through her life, she would come back and perform at the Cleveland Playhouse. I was very close to her, and one time I had a party and invited friends to meet her, and we were having a clam bake. And I thought these were very sophisticated people. And when they arrived, they all turned into being 10 years old, and they all followed her around saying, "Cackle for me, say those lines." And poor Maggie, I had a house on the lake and we were out on the deck, and so finally this man tormented her so much. She said, "Rent the movie." And he kept saying, "No, do that cackle for me." And so Maggie, who was very tiny, pulled herself up and gave out this blood-curdling cackle. And with that, there was a bolt of lightning in the sky and thunder, and we had this torrential downpour. And my clam bake was washed out. We had to order pizza. But so the magic of The Wicked Witch is so profound that it has stayed with all of us. And just one other thing about that movie. In 1956, it appeared on television, and it became a yearly event. And in that first year, The Cowardly Lion introduced it to America and to a whole new generation of people that hadn't seen it. We still didn't have DVDs, et cetera, or streaming or any of the things we have now. And a little girl sat there with The Cowardly Lion, and her name was Liza Minnelli, and they introduced The Wizard of Oz. And it became, of course, a yearly event on television for 20 years, and now, of course, DVDs and streaming have taken the need for that away. But it became really a family event. Everyone stopped everything once a year to sit and watch that brilliant show and to still be dazzled by The Wicked Witch of the West. Okay, so now we come to the book that this musical is based on. So keep in mind, what you're seeing tonight is really a prequel to The Wizard of Oz. They like to say that a lot of things happened in Oz before Dorothy arrived, and that substantially is the story you're going to see tonight. Gregory Maguire was the novelist who wrote Wicked. It's an extraordinary novel. It's really an adult novel. It's a very strong reworking of the story. The point I want to make, though, is Frank Baum had such an inspiration about how to tell this story that it has influenced every other work that has ever happened because of it. And so keep in mind, in 1975, there was a black musical version called The Wiz, which was absolutely fantastic, turned into a movie with Michael Jackson and Diana Ross. But it had that same, even though it was very contemporary and hip, it had that same basic sense of humanity and home and simplicity and love that makes The Wizard of Oz such an extraordinary piece. Okay, so here we have Gregory Maguire, who's going to take the story and go back before Dorothy arrives and deal substantially with the two witches, the Good Witch and the Wicked Witch of the West, that he will name Elphaba. And Elphaba will become the hero of the show you see tonight. And the notion about Elphaba is she's green, as you know, and the end result is this, of course, makes her different and therefore very suspect. And she becomes a hero. And in watching this show, watch the audience tonight. I mean, children 10 years old and grandmothers 90 years old relate in exactly the same way. Elphaba is the sort of loser. But remember, we all have a little bit of green in all of us. And so this is what pulls us into the story. So the thing that was so brilliant about what Gregory Maguire did, aside from taking the story back earlier, was that he told the story from the point of view of the Wicked Witch of the West. It's a brilliant idea, and it plays perfectly. Now, the Wicked Witch of the West was never named, and he named her Elphaba. Now, keep in mind, the author of the original work is Lyman Frank Baum. LFB, Elphaba, is how he came up with the name, adding a few little. So watch that as you see the show tonight. There are all kinds of little word games like that. The novel is extraordinary. It's like reading the work of Tolkien. It's so dimensional and complex. He ultimately got so carried away, Gregory Maguire wrote 4 novels about Oz. He did Wicked, Son of a Witch, I love to say that title, A Lion Among Men, and Out of Oz. And so with these 4 stories, he creates this phantasmagoria, this world that's extraordinary. He makes the wizard more like a fascist, and he makes Elphaba more like a freedom fighter. She's fighting for the rights of animals who are being oppressed in the story that you're going to see. So it's a remarkable work. And it's, of course, a perfect idea for development in the musical theater. Okay, so Gregory Maguire has great success with this work. Incidentally, if you're looking for Christmas gifts for young people, look up Gregory Maguire's name. He has a list. He's been very prolific. He's written countless books for young people. The Wicked sequence is really books for adults, certainly not for children. Okay, so the end result is there is this monumental book that's just waiting to be developed. Interesting, Demi Moore discovered the book, fell in love with it, and optioned it for United Pictures. And so the option on the work was taken. And they tried to develop a man named Mark Platt, who was the head of United Studios at the time, of Universal Studios at the time, worked on it, and they were in the second draft. He was going to do a non-musical version of Wicked, and he could never quite get the story to his satisfaction. So that's what was happening at Universal. And at the same time then, Stephen Schwartz, the great composer, who in the 1970s, within a very short period of time, created Godspell, Pippin, and The Magic Show. Now, many of you have forgotten about The Magic Show. It's really a great show, and if you didn't see it or have forgotten it, it's really worth going back to the recording of it. I wish someone would reconsider. As you know, Godspell and Pippin have both just been revived. Pippin to great, great success, winning the Tony this time. And the end result is there is still this wonderful version of The Magic Show that should be redeveloped. But in any case, Stephen Schwartz had this great career in the 70s, and then he went for a long period of time where he did a show called The Baker's Wife. He did a show called Working, and it did not really click with the audience. And so he moved into writing music for movies, and especially for Disney. Happily, he did The Hunchback of Notre Dame, which is about to be developed as a major musical for Broadway, and he developed Pocahontas and a whole body of work for Disney. So he certainly was not languishing in this period, but he felt that he had been sort of mistreated on Broadway and went through several very difficult experiences trying to do Broadway shows, especially with a show called Children of Eden, which was, in my mind, a wonderful show, but didn't have a great deal of success. So the end result was, when he read Wicked, he knew immediately it had to be done as a musical. He said to his agent, find out if the rights are available, and the agent came back and said, well, Universal Studios owns the rights, so you'll have to deal with them. And he went to Mark Platt and talked him into going along with the idea of developing a musical. Mark Platt, at the same time, was still developing it as a movie, but finally he gave it up, saying what we were missing was the music. The music makes the story sing, and of course he was right. And it took 3.5 years for the work to be developed. And Stephen Schwartz worked in an absolutely maniacal way to get this work up. Luckily, because Universal Studios owned the rights, the budget for the show was $14 million. And that's a lot of money for a work that maybe wouldn't work. I mean, there's no real guarantee that it would work. There is all the celebrity of the movie of Oz and the books of Oz, but there wasn't at the time the same celebrity about Wicked, the novel. So the end result was Stephen Schwartz recommended that a woman named Winnie Holzman, who was a television writer who did 2 great series, My So-Called Life and 30-something, and she wrote about young girls, so she had this very strong sense of how to deal with young women. And so she would refocus the whole story. The novel is so complex. There are 37 major characters, and there are over a dozen major storylines. So it's very, very difficult to decide how you're going to get this in a singular form so you can sing it. And it was Winnie Holzman who really came up with the idea of substantially, this is a story about 2 women. And it's about the good witch and the bad witch. And of course, this is a brilliant inspiration. And watch that whole development. When they first meet, they have this wonderful song. They become roommates in school. and they absolutely hate one another, and they have a song called Loathing, where they loathe everything about one another. One because she's white and blonde and pink, and one because she's green, and they can't connect. Everything about them means that they dislike one another. But Winnie Holtzman certainly understood the premise that Oscar Wilde had. Oscar Wilde used to say, women call each other a lot of other things before they call each other sister. And this is very much what happened in this story. Watch how these two women who instantly loathe one another finally become to understand one another and in some ways respect one another. It's a wonderful story. You know, we've had this whole body of sort of buddy musicals. I mean, you think of The Producers. It's about Max Bialystock and his accountant. Or you think of Dirty Rotten Scoundrels and the men there. Or you think of The Search of the Grail with Spamalot. And, of course, a group of men going off in search of the Holy Grail, a sort of buddies story that's told. So in this case, we have a story about sisters who start out loathing one another, who come to respect one another. And the way the story is developed then is really brilliant. And it's Winnie Holtzman who gave that show this focus so we could watch these two women and watch the badness in the good witch and the goodness in the bad witch. They're able to really bring in so many paradoxes in the way the story is told. They hired Joe Mantello, who's a great New York director. He's worked with a lot of experimental theater groups. He's an actor and has a tremendous sensitivity for how actors work. So he was able to help shape the show because he worked with so many off-Broadway plays where he had to develop plays. He understood the importance of text and storyline and through line for characters. So he was excellent in always shaping the show and giving it a focus so it could be developed. They then hired Eugene Lee to design the show. In the novel, there's a major section in the novel called the Time Dragon. And the Time Dragon is this enormous dragon who is sort of the symbol of a sort of ancient religious cult. So when you go in the theater, look in the top of the proscenium, you're going to see this giant time dragon. No one in the audience is going to know who it is, and you can nudge them and say, oh, look, it's the time dragon. But in any case, he plays a very important part in the novel, and it's very interesting. He plays the ultimate part in the visualization of this story. Keep in mind, there are 57 different scenes in this story. And so the end result is they have to find a way of bringing all this together in some kind of abstracted way. And Eugene Lee, as a designer, is the perfect person to do this. He worked at Trinity Rep for many, many years. He's designed a lot of the major Sweeney Todd in its original version and Candide in its environmental version. So he really understands how to deal with abstraction. He makes everything like a clock and the parts of a clock. Sometimes it's done so subtly. Watch how the good witch makes her first entrance. You think it's a bubble that she's entering in. It's really the pendulum of a clock. And clock pieces are the major way of uniting the whole story. It's visually dazzling, highly innovative, and very compelling, and it will pull you into the show. The show never stops moving because it's so visually dazzling, because of the conception of making the whole show like clockwork. And then finally, Susan Hilferty, who's the designer, creates absolutely some of the most extraordinary costumes. She won a Tony Award for her work on this show. And it's a mixture of the original designs from the original novel, sort of mixed with John Galliano fashion, high fashion at the other end. And when we go to Emerald City, it's absolutely extraordinary. So you're in for a very special treat, and I hope that this show takes you over the rainbow. Thank you very much.